Hello and welcome back to the SecurityMetrics podcast. I'm Jen Stone. I'm a principal security analyst here at SecurityMetrics. And today I have a super interesting guest on. His name is Craig Olsen. He's a cybersecurity architect for Liberty Mutual Insurance. Craig, welcome to the show. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm glad to be here, Jen. A little bit about myself. Well, I've been involved in cybersecurity for over 12 years. I worked for a company called Liberty Mutual. You may or may not have heard of Liberty Mutual. You may
Tiny little company.
the Doug and Limu commercials. I think I get people who like to do the Liberty jingle and all that. So I've worked there for this is my 15th year. It is the only professional job I've had. It's the job I started right out of college.
Wow.
And I always tell people, if you think you messed up an interview, I tell them, at least you didn't do what I did, which was show up a week early to the interview, which is what I did. So it always makes people feel a lot better because they're all, oh, I should have said this. I'm like, I showed up a week early. And I always say, I played it off as, well, at least I didn't show up a week late. So,
yeah, that would have been worse. Yeah.
They somehow must have saw something through that and they hired me. I started off as a developer. I wasn't a very good developer, but I developed things and I didn't take down my company or anything like that. So, and so I guess a little bit about myself in terms of how I got to cybersecurity, because I think a lot of people want to know that journey. So about 12 years ago, going back to about 2008, I kind of had this epiphany where it was that security is one of those things that a company shouldn't outsource.
Mm-hmm.
And so, kind of looking and recognizing there might be something coming down the line, like, oh, I don't know, maybe a recession. There was an opportunity to do a lateral move from being a developer just an analyst, security analyst. Mm-hmm. So I took the opportunity and I've loved it ever since. And it has provided a wealth of opportunity and experience. About myself, I reside in Utah, the great state. I moved here about 3 years ago.
Awesome.
And before that, I lived in New Hampshire for the prior 12 years. And so I let's, go Sox, go Patriots. This is where your viewership just declines.
Everybody's like, oh, New Hampshire.
Yeah, one of those. Yeah, New Hampshire. Yeah. And so I loved it being out there. For myself, I've been married for almost 18 years, and I have one son who is 6 and keeps our lives very busy.
Oh, that's awesome. So you're in security you started off as a security analyst, so a fairly low-level position there, or was it a little, tell me a little bit about your journey to where you are now with Liberty Mutual.
Where I'm at now. It's been quite a journey. Yeah, so for over 12 years. So yeah, I started off just as an analyst. I think I would run around and do risk assessments. One of the things that I was brought on was to take this crazy tool that was called a static code analyzer and try to scan applications. And I think the first one I scanned took 4 days. And I think I needed a doctorate to be able to review the results. And the person who wrote the app didn't understand any of it. And so we were very much in kind of our infancy within our company. We had some security, we had that. And I think as a testament to this is during the Great Recession, as companies contracted, the two big areas within my company that grew was security and mobile.
Oh, interesting.
And if you think about the App Store was kind of, debuted and the iPhone and all that. So there was an opportunity for this new market, this new potential.
Sure.
So yeah, I kind of moved up. I've just stayed, moved around doing different things, specializing in app security. Mobile security was a thing that I specialized in for a long time. A lot of things with privacy, identity. And for the last 5 years, I've been focused on the public cloud.
Which is why we have you here to talk to us today. Securing the cloud is a huge topic of conversation. It seems like more and more organizations are moving to the cloud. And I was really fascinated by your story because you helped with that migration to AWS, as I understand it.
Yeah, yeah. So sorry. I was going to say, I probably should say a little bit about Liberty just for a second, my company.
Yeah.
You may have heard of us. You may not have heard of us. We're about 55,000 employees worldwide in 18 different countries of operation. We have about 5,000 IT employees and about 200 in just security alone.
Wow.
So very large organization. I am not alone, but sometimes I feel that I need a bigger army. And sometimes I look back and look for the cavalry and they're not there. But it's great working amongst a lot of different people and a lot of technologies.
Excellent. And so tell us about Liberty Mutual is in AWS. So tell us a little bit about why you chose the cloud to begin with.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's two reasons. I'm going to give you the first reason, and then you're going to say, what's the real reason? And that's number two. The first reason is that we had aging hardware. And the aging hardware was getting old and deprecated. We built our own private cloud. And so it was just the cost of maintenance and all of this. The ability to go to the cloud just seemed like a better idea.
So a decision had to be made.
A decision was made. Now, I'm going to be honest here. The reason number two is the real reason.
Okay.
Or one of the primary drivers. I would say that there's multiple drivers and forces at play. And yes, aging hardware is a reason to go to the cloud. But one of the biggest ones was the ability for us to scale and move quickly. So there's a project, and there's been a number of projects by large companies that deal with things like the autonomous driving car. And what really is interesting from an insurance company, that from that term of disruption that is always thrown around in the industry, the idea that when Google says we're going to self-insure our car, you're going to have every insurance company in the world with their ears perk up. Because if they can build a car that drives itself, that's got cameras and sensors all over the place, and it can replay any of those at any moment to prove that it wasn't at fault in an accident, then what's the need for an insurer? And if you've got other technologies like IoT, like a Nest thermostat or others that can then warn you that, hey, your house is getting cold, you might want to act on it before your pipes freeze, so therefore you have an insurance claim, you need to do something. So to be honest, the big primary, one of the drivers, and not the primary, but a key driver, was the ability for Liberty Mutual to move out of the traditional way of doing things and embrace different ways in the future. And the way we would do that and move rapidly and at scale and a global front is to go to the cloud, because that gives us the ability to try out new markets, try out new technologies, try out new concepts, and rapidly move. And we couldn't do it at the pace by which we were doing it before. It was like a backpack of bricks that we were carrying along, because it's mainframes and open VMS and all these old things. That to me, so it's hardware, yes, but really I think a lot of it was, as a company, we wanted to embrace all the benefits of elasticity, immutability, the ability to move quickly geolocation wise. I agree.
That makes total sense. But then sometimes, especially in more established companies, and maybe this is just my perception from some of the customers that I deal with, is the more established an organization is, the more hesitant they are about new things like the cloud. So how did you get past security concerns around moving to the cloud?
Let me show you my work laptop. So but there's a sticker on it, and hopefully you can see that.
Yes.
It says there is no cloud. It's somebody else's computer. And that I've had that sticker for 5 years. And it was really interesting because we had a lot of our development community was just begging for the cloud. They saw a lot of the benefits of continuous integration, continuous deployment and delivery options, rapid scale to delivery. Like they looked at it with like huge benefits. And here's security. Right, we're on the other side of the table, and so their side of the table, they'd have these stickers that would like, I built my data center in 5 minutes. My other computer is an EC2, instance.
I've seen those stickers as well.
You've seen those, right? Yeah, and so you have like this, like very much, and then on the other side of the table was all of security, and we're like, it's somebody else's computer, right? It's, and so from our point, right, as security professionals, the ability to know possession, right, is a key attribute.
Sure.
If I can't attest to certain things. So there was some trepidation.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's very interesting, I like to tell people, was back in, we started looking at the cloud about 2014, 2015. And there was a key incident that had happened, a key event that really got us nervous. And I always bring it up and I say, how many people here, and I would ask, my students or anybody this, I'd say, how many of you have heard of code spaces? And you see people start looking around like, I've never heard of code spaces. Well, you've never heard of them because they were murdered in the cloud. Oh. Because they were held ransom in June of 2014. Somebody got a hold of their master account and asked for a ransom. Said, hey, you're going to pay us. And the company refused. And so with that master account, they deleted their Amazon account. And in that account contained their backup, their code, and their data.
Oh,
And so the headlines at the time said murder in the cloud.
okay.
And it really highlighted this, like, well, wait a minute, we're going to this cloud. Does that put us in a position of an incident where recovery is not possible? Because we had spent years and decades building out full redundancy in our data centers. We had multiple data centers around the United States, around the world. And we had tape backups, and we've got offsite storage, and we've got warm and hot site capabilities and all this. And then you're like, wait a minute, if I'm going out to the cloud, I have to put a trust that's out there. And so there was some hesitancy from security. And a lot of it was just, particularly for myself and others, understanding what the cloud is.
Right.
This is the part that I think that really confounds people, because a lot of people think, oh, cloud it's anti-security. It's the anti-pattern. You can't be secure in the cloud. And I disagree.
Yeah, I hear that a lot, and I also disagree.
Yeah. I think that there are challenges and risks that come from operating in the cloud, like backup and recovery. But I believe that from some of the benefits of the cloud, that you have the capability of securing your company's infrastructure better than you could on-prem.
I'm with you on that, because of the centralized nature of it, because of the standardization that you get out there. There's a lot of reasons why I believe the cloud can be more secure than an on-prem development. But it's like you said, you have to understand what the cloud is and how to use it. For example, you said, hey, these guys, they had all of their backups in one thing and deleted it. That is one key time where I see a lot of people very confused about what does the cloud give me. So I'll say, hey, Kate, tell me about your backup and recovery capability. Tell me about your failover. Tell me about, should anything happen. And they say, oh, I don't need that type of thing because AWS has it. And I'm like, okay, AWS has it for their systems, and if you properly use it, then yes, you also have it. But there is an architecture piece that has to go in there. So what I really liked when I originally talked to you about the cloud, we were fortunate enough to be on a panel together for an ICS. Was it IC?
It was IC squared. Yeah, back when we could meet together. Yeah,
it was. IC squared. That's right. And you talked about mitigating risks in the cloud, and so you've developed these kind of 10 steps to mitigating the risk in the clouds, based on defense in depth. Now, a lot of people have heard of defense in depth, but some people haven't. So maybe just kind of cover that concept briefly for us.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so defense in depth, I think there's two simple analogies that people use. The most simplest one is an onion, that you've got layers that you have to peel back. There's one that I like to use. That's just like medieval castle structure, on how the castle is built. Right, just a couple of concepts around that. You've got a village. The village is going to alert you when invaders are coming. Well, there's a detection method right there. And you usually have a moat. You've got a drawbridge. You've got different layers and courtyards. You structure the staircases going up so that the people who are going up and trying to attack are having to use their left hand because of the way how they'd be drawing their sword. The people defending it would be using their dominant hand. So you put all these layers into it so that you have depth. And I think that oftentimes, sometimes companies try to do this, but what they end up doing is a really hard, crunchy shell, and they got a really gooey center, right? And they say that, well, I have a firewall. Yeah. And then as soon as you get through that firewall, sky's the limit. Everything is yours.
Or I'll get this. Everybody needs a login. Terrific.
Yeah, great. I agree, but once you get through,
what else do you get? Yeah.
And I would like to say that. So the steps that I kind of put here, I spoke at Utah State University last fall, and I kind of did it for just steps that everybody can use. And I think that there's a lot of companies that are not sure about the cloud. They don't know about the cloud. There's some hesitancy to the cloud, and for the most part, they just don't know. And some of them, they're like, I think we're using the cloud. Well, you probably should know if you're using the cloud, right? I mean, there's some of it are completely like ignorant. You're using the cloud and you're there. And so I tried to structure this as just simple steps that anybody can do. And then, just so that it gives them a little bit more, because the idea on this is if you can just start building a couple of those layers in here, then it just helps you. And then
Sure.
when you want to get more in depth, there's plenty more you can do.
Then let's walk through some of these steps, starting with passwords.
Yeah, passwords. So I feel like this is kind of one of those standard security responses, like use. And I think the key on passwords isn't complex passwords. I think everyone knows this and has been advocated for the last few years. It's not complex passwords. It's long passwords,
It is
long
long
passphrases,
Mm-hmm.
right? 16 characters, 20 characters, whatever that is.
Sure.
The key is length. And it's one of these that it's amazing where companies, still have old policies. They have no idea. So with passwords kind of comes up with other types of things, right? Well, do you deactivate users? Do you actually have permissions of, what people allowed to store? But I often talk about bonus points, and the notion of a password manager. Probably 8-9 years ago was probably a foreign concept that people were like, what is this crazy technology you're talking about? And nowadays with, things like LastPass being relatively available, and even on your phone where they've got password stores, there's no excuse to not utilize these types of things. So I think the key is that the password is the front door into any infrastructure, whether it's your company's infrastructure, your cloud infrastructure. Just have long 16 plus character passphrases that you have at least some assurances that it's not going to be easily guessed by a computer.
And this can be configured in the cloud. So whether it's AWS or Azure or Azure for us Hicks or or GCP, right? Any of these platforms have a way that you can go in and configure password length and password complexity if that's your jam. But so making sure that those are actually set, not just a recommendation or a training item with users. It's like you can have a bunch of employees in the company and they say, "Oh, please do a long password," and everybody goes, "Okay." So,
yeah, exactly. I'm fine if this is my long password. Like that's fine. But yeah, I struggle. It's very interesting because we're creatures of habit, and so we tend to not change things. And it's always kind of fun when I would tell people over the years, it's like, oh, well, I've got like an 8-character password that has to be rotated every 90 days, right? And things like PCI require 90 days. And so you're like, well, chances are you're only going to change 1 or 2 of those characters every 90 days.
Yeah.
And so now I've got kind of a formula, right? I've got a pattern to go after, and how is that any better? So I think it's passwords. It's just basic level. We can talk for hours on like the password, but I just want to kind of emphasize, if you got any form of cloud, anything, just put a policy in to make sure that you've got adequate length protection on it.
And use a password manager. I do. I think it's great. And closely related to passwords is multi-factor authentication.
Yeah, this one, and there's been a lot of conversation over this years, especially recently with things like YubiKey and smart card things. There's a knowledge-based behavior is starting to kind of pick up here a little bit more. But just the notion of what is multi-factor authentication, the ability for it to be that additional factor, you want this for the account. And this really kind of goes back to that story I alluded to earlier with code spaces, right? Because it was just that compromise of that master account, and then they've got the keys to your kingdom at that point. And even more so, the email by which that account is also tied to should probably have a strong password and different password and multi-factor setup. So I feel like there has to be this notion of, it's why attack the bank when you just attack the email and reset the password back to the email? Like, let's make sure we put in the right depth here. But MFA is a key component. It definitely makes it harder for threat actors to be able to try to impose upon your access. The extra credit on this one, and I think this, is try not to use the SMS based, just because SMS can be easily spoofed. You can ask the Twitter CEO of that recently, where he was able to be compromised through that. So there's wonderful apps you can install on your phone that generate that one-time password. Use that.
And I don't know about you, but I now have 4 different authenticator apps on my phone for different things.
Oh boy.
Wouldn't it be nice if I could use just one authenticator for all of these things?
I'm down to 2. I use Authy because I love Authy because I can control the control the encryption key, and I can also back it up, which is really great. So way, from a recovery standpoint, right, that's always the fear, is if I lose, I lose the device, and then I got to go through this lengthy process of pulling out here's my printed one-time passwords that I've stored in some other location, and trying to reset all of them. So Authy allows you to have that backup. And then the other one is the Microsoft Authenticator.
Right.
Which I would suggest this, and if you've got, this is also, I love the idea of trying to go passwordless, and I know Microsoft has been pushing for that. If you can do it, do it. Whether that's Duo or Microsoft, the ability just to eliminate a password and just have that tie to the device where it's just an approve, it makes the user experience better. World of difference.
Agreed. All right, so moving on to the third thing in your list is encryption. Talk a little bit about encryption and why it's important.
Well, I want to talk about why encryption in the cloud is different.
Oh, okay.
I think that we sometimes confuse this. We think, and Jen, we were on the panel back in January, and you've probably heard this phrase where if you think encryption solves your problems, you either don't understand encryption nor you understand your problem.
Or exactly.
Yeah, because once you have something encrypted, it now becomes a key management problem. And how do you secure the key to that? Sure. So the reason why I want to talk about why encryption is different in the cloud is because this is the key thing. Encryption is a wonderful thing that allows us, from a regulatory compliance perspective, to attest to a number of things. Right? And in the cloud, the notion of it being somebody else's computer, encryption is a key thing that separates that. Now, the way how Amazon works and how many of these other cloud providers work is the encryption that is used is a volume level encryption. So think of it as just a self-encrypting drive that you would have in your data center. And that self-encrypting drive, if you throw it on the back of a truck and it's driving off to some mountain that's got a lot of iron in it, and it hits a bump, and this drive falls off, and someone picks it up and they go plug it in, they can't see the contents.
They can't see the contents, yeah.
So therefore, we get safe harbor protection, so we don't have to worry about breach notification because we have that. It's the same thing with why we encrypt our laptops, right? We encrypt them, we encrypt our phones so that we don't have to tell people that there could have been their data on that.
Highly applicable to mobile devices, to devices that we expect to go someplace, possibly get lost, possibly get stolen.
Exactly. So you say, well, what about the cloud? Well, so the cloud works in this volume level encryption. And I have to say this because the only thing that encryption protects you from in the cloud is the cloud provider itself.
Right.
So volume level encryption. So when we encrypt an S3 bucket in Amazon, we are protecting that data from Amazon. It's so that when Amazon gets subpoenaed and they march in and grab that server and dump the contents of it, and our data is sharded across all of it, that our data is encrypted. And we don't have to say, hey, customers, your data was included with this and it was unintentional.
Right.
And that's protection. But the key is understanding what it protects, but also recognizing what it doesn't protect. It doesn't protect me from accessing that same S3 bucket. I'm still going to see the data in clear text as if I would on the network. And so I think that sometimes people kind of go, oh, well, everything's encrypted.
Yeah. Well,
it is encrypted. And the key to encryption in the cloud, particularly from a regulatory compliance perspective, is if you can control access to that server. So if I can create an immutable instance where no human has access to that, everything's built through code, built through pipelines, no one has access to that. Therefore, now that volume level encryption, our data is encrypted.
Agreed.
I can't see it. So there is, from a compliance perspective, value in just that notion, but people have to understand what that means. I gain access to that server, I see it.
And here's what's difficult is that if you get maybe an assessor who isn't as familiar with some of these cloud concepts, that's not going to be good enough. Or that's going to cause them heartburn because they don't know how to write about it. Because sometimes, for example, PCI has some very specific language. And then you're supposed to write to that specific language. And sometimes the way the cloud does things, it's absolutely adequate and it's absolutely covered, but then you go to write it and you go, oh, I sound like I don't even know what the question is asking because I'm answering it in a different way. Or do I really want to do a compensating control for this when the reality is that it's not compensating for anything? This is just not something that happens in this way there, right? Yeah. And so one of the things that I generally recommend to people who ask me about this is if you are super clear about how the compliance requirements work and how your cloud provider or cloud solution covers those requirements, you're going to win your your battle a lot quicker without having to do stuff that's kind of dumb.
Yeah. Now, one of the fundamental principles that I operate in security is, can you defend it?
Yeah.
And that goes from anywhere. We're going to make a decision. Well, can you defend it? Right? Can you tell me, tomorrow, a week from now, a month from now, why you did this? Oftentimes, there's this idea in security that we have to go for perfection.
Right.
And I am under the opinion that pretty good will always be better than perfect, unless you're the government guarding the nukes, right? Then you have to have perfect security because that's required. But for the average company, pretty good is better than perfect, because perfect is hard to prove. It's very expensive to implement. It's very hard to maintain. And so for that, it's like, can you just tell a good story, right?
Actively doing business is very different from not deploying a nuke. So there's that.
Exactly. And I think it's very interesting, even just like on risk, right? Sometimes, especially cybersecurity professionals, we like to throw risk around. We say, that's very risky, right? And then we say, that's going to be a risk, and we may quantify it with some range. But we also have to remember that we work for a company, and that risk to the business of not doing something or exploring new markets may be greater than any of that cybersecurity risk that's there. And so I think sometimes, that the traditional security, we had that curmudgeon, right? The ministry of no, right?
Yeah.
I think I've been called the Fourth Reich a couple of times.
Right? Oh dear.
And it's it's like the Department of No, right? It's the Department of No. And I often say it's no, we should be the Department of How. And it's not how could you, but it's how can I help you? And it's recognizing you need to get to this place, and how can I help you along the way, that I can tell a really good story that when we get audited, we can defend the decisions that we made. Yeah. And I think oftentimes people just shoot for perfection and then realize it's too hard, and then they end up doing nothing.
Right. Rather than how do I do business, and yet still, and I take that approach as well, even as an auditor. And so I think that opens the conversations up. So I get to hear a lot of more interesting ideas from people, because I'll get calls 6 months after an audit, 6 months before they even have to have the next one. And they're saying, hey, we're thinking about doing this thing, but we want your opinion on it. Here's what we're going to try, and here's why. And so I get a business justification, I get their ideas, and then I say, okay, here's some of the things that might catch you up. And so it's that active, interesting, how can we make the security work around your great new idea? And those are some of the best, as a security professional, those are some of the best conversations I have.
Absolutely agree. I love those proactive conversations. I love our security champions, the ones that are, when I talk to them, they already know exactly where my concerns are. And I think that one of the things I do want to say is, in our journey to the cloud, 6 years ago, there was a lot of headbutting. And then what I think is over the few years after that, we realized that we didn't need to, that we had the same goal. Our architects on the development side, they don't want our developers just to go out and push terrible code up.
Sure.
Because it causes instability within the organization. And so they had some of the same reasons. So availability was just as much of a concern as we were. They don't want people having production access, because, well, if you make a change in production, it's not in a build pipeline, then if the next time you do a build, you lose the changes that were made. Right. And so they've become our biggest champions. And I think that idea, in fact, as an auditor, you might find this different, where we headbutted, but we had to find that common enemy. And so we turned to the common enemy, which was audit. Yeah. Because they would come in there and swing. And I used to say, I'm like, look, you're going to have, a stack of audit findings this big unless you fix this particular problem. Yeah. Well, they don't want that. They don't want that audit finding. They don't want to have to deal with that. So they're like, help me. I can help you. And that has been just an amazing journey.
That is great.
Recognizing that the developer is not my enemy. They are my friends, and they are trying to do the right thing. And I think sometimes security kind of gets that wrong, right? Unfortunately, we think, vulnerabilities are given by developers.
No.
They don't. Yeah,
no. And if you have the right auditor, it's a journey of discovery on what's working and what's not against whatever they're assessing against, right? And so then it becomes, instead of making your auditor your enemy, it's what is that compliance statement that we are all together trying to figure out how to solve. So getting everybody on the same team, for sure. Yeah. Okay, let's move.
Let's move on. We can keep talking.
Oh my gosh, we could seriously, we could talk about any one of these forever. But Hunter's going to yell at me if we make this a 3-hour podcast. So, moving on to logging.
Moving on to logging. Yeah, so I think one of the things that we talked about, we kind of talked about like one of the reasons why the cloud has benefits, and that when I made that statement that has a capability, one of the fundamental, what I think is benefits of operating in the cloud environment is a single visibility plane.
Right. It sure makes it easy as an auditor.
Yeah, and well, exactly. You think about it on your traditional data center. I got syslogs over here.
Yeah.
I have network firewall logs over here. I need to aggregate them over here. And you're trying to aggregate this entire thing. In the cloud, you have a single visibility plane that's associated to the management plane. And the key on this one that I always tell people is just make sure that logging is turned on.
Right.
And it's not hard. There's just ways to always just say, yep, always make this turned on. You can write Lambda rules to always just make sure that logging is turned on for the services that you consume, but have it there. It's part of telling that good story is the ability that you can say, this is what we did, who did it, why they did it. And so that's why I feel like sometimes we assume things are always turned on,
but they're not.
They're not.
Double check. Yeah. It's a quick look at the dashboard. Yeah, for sure. And that logging is related in a lot of ways to the managed services portion of AWS or of any cloud service, actually.
Yeah, so managed services, I think, is one of the key values that we have within the cloud. And anybody who has struggled with the idea of trying to patch servers, the idea that one of the key benefits in the cloud is that I can make that a contract item and a requirement for a provider.
Yeah.
And I think about something like the Rational Database Service in AWS, that's RDS. And you can run Oracle, SQL Server, MS SQL, Postgres, Aurora, whatever that's out there, MySQL. And what's great about that is it's a database platform, but Amazon is required to do the patching.
Yes.
And so if you think about this idea where it's like, I don't have to patch the database servers. So you consume managed services. I think there's that idea where it's like SaaS over PaaS over IaaS is kind of the ranking that we always do. Because the further you go down the stack, the more you have to do. And if you're already in an environment where, why should I spin up an Oracle instance on an EC2 instance and have to try to harden that Oracle instance and patch the EC2 instance? And I can't redeploy it very easily. Just pass that burden on, right? We talk about risk transference. Transfer that away. The extra credit on that one is just make sure, especially in RDS, there's little things like little small versions, like they'll always do the patching in the major versions, but companies, people can sometimes uncheck a little box that they can kind of avoid the minor upgrades. So I don't want people to do that. So we just make sure everybody does it. But
nice.
So, consume anything managed. It just makes life easier.
Yeah. From my perspective, every organization I go into that uses the cloud, the more they abstract their operations to the services level rather than deeper down in the stack, the more secure they tend to be. Yeah,
and the faster they can move. I think the big trend that I've noticed over the last couple of years is this concept of serverless.
Yes,
and it's really interesting when you talk to people because it's like, well, run a vulnerability report. There is no server.
There isn't a server.
It's just not yours.
It's not your responsibility. It's somebody else's.
Exactly. So I've left shifted that away, and so now I'm just running code. I'm doing this one microservice here, and I do this thing here, and it's amazing, how much that feeds in agility and scale and velocity. These buzzword bingo terms that people throw out, but it definitely helps us move quicker.
When I have a new customer and I do that initial audit review with them, and they tell me I don't have an operating system. You guys are the best. I do a little happy dance. It's great.
You just grab a whole section and be like, delete, right?
Yeah.
It's all gone. Yeah. I think that's the future. Now, obviously, how do you secure serverless is, there's a reason why these little startup companies have been bought out rather quickly because there's an opportunity. How do you get in that runtime? How do you look for, areas of indicators of compromise? So serverless isn't perfect, but from a development scale, it moves really, really fast.
It does. All right, then, backups.
Backups. This really kind of comes back to the code spaces story that I shared earlier. Have a good story when it comes to backups. Nothing says you cannot back up back to your internal network. Nothing says you can't back up to another cloud provider. Nothing says you can't
Right.
back up to another account. The key on this one is tell a good story. What I would suggest is companies not try to create like a backup account and back up everything there, because now you might as well just have a gold mine with some arrow signs
Yeah.
on it, because it's like, well, forget
Take this.
attacking the app, just
Yeah.
go after the backup. And I think that there also needs to tell a good story around recovery, right? It's great to have, processes that can always back up, but who's authorized to initiate that recovery?
Right.
And where can they recover to? We often talk about one of the largest Amazon regions is US East 1. It's in Northern Virginia.
Sure.
And there's 5 availability zones. And so you're kind of everyone's stacked. Now, if US East 1 goes down and everyone wants to recover to US East 2, which is somewhere in Ohio, there's 3 availability zones, which means it's not big enough to take the gigantic funnel that's going to be, coming in there. So part of your backup needs to consider, okay, if I'm going to replicate to another region, what is that going to look like? If I'm going to recover to another region, is everyone else recovering at that same point too as well?
Sure.
And just have a plan, right? Tell a good story on it. Back up on-prem, other locations. Just don't put yourself in a position where recovery is not possible.
Right. And it's important to note that for example, if you're in the HIPAA space, you have availability. That's a critical thing. Whereas if you're in the PCI space, it is confidentiality and integrity, right? So knowing what you have to provide for might change your backup strategy a little bit.
Great point. Yeah, even for privacy, if you've got GDPR, right? Country of origin and residency are huge requirements. And so, you don't want to back up to another region that is out of compliance with things like GDPR. So I think a lot of it is just trying to have that plan and just think through it. Who's authorized to recover?
Yeah.
Do we allow that, right? Or is that kind of a break the glass model where like we only allow people to have that? Because last thing you want is somebody to, attack your application and then blow away your backup.
Sure. And then having input from the business so that the technical side can make good decisions on these things. You don't want to have you want to have an emergency mode operations for HIPAA where PCI might be able to be down for a couple of days. But how is the technical side supposed to know this if the business isn't part of the planning process?
Agreed. And they have to have those conversations. We had a opportunity to look at like backups for one of our call centers. And it was, so it was having conversations with the business that if this thing happened, how do we reroute some of our telephony systems over here? And what would we do on that? And then with that, you brought up a great concern with, especially if you're a company that takes credit cards, now you have to make sure it's PCI, right? So that you're blacking out when someone says, oh, sure, here's my credit card number. So there's a lot of considerations that have to play into that. I feel like sometimes we just think, well, it's in the cloud, it's backed up.
Yeah.
That's what the cloud is. It's just a big backup storage. And the number of people that I've seen their eyes get big, and you start seeing the nervous sweats kind of, as you start explaining code spaces and all these things that, just you might want to tell a good story, because at some point, if you have to tell that story and it's not there, update that resume. So
hopefully not.
Hopefully not. Right.
Okay.
Positive on this podcast.
Positive. Usually. Tell us about access.
Yeah, this is really the key is a lot of it is around how we access the cloud. So I talk about, we did passwords before, we talked about MFA. One of the keys, just there's opportunities to use modern auth is one of the great things, whether that's single sign-on services that you get that are OpenID or OAuth or SAML. Make sure, I think on that one is try to set that up. There's value in the ability for you to maintain governance over your accounts. What you don't want is that people are setting up their own accounts and then they leave the company and you can't pull that back. You can't retain that back. So I feel like, especially for smaller companies, that tends to be more of they just don't have a good story to tell around how access is granted and stuff like that.
Sure. They don't understand that you provide access to a role, not to an individual, because the minute you start providing access to individuals, it gets too granularized, and then you don't know how to kind of, I don't know what they have access to, as they have changed jobs several times in the same company, right? Or we don't know that we've gotten every piece of it when they left the company. And so making sure, like the word you used was governance, and that is key in access matters.
Yeah. Oh no, absolutely. And I think one of the most one of the most powerful concepts in the cloud is also its most confusing, and that's identity and access management.
Right.
It's the idea that I can do as fine or granular controls that I want to do.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens is that, well, it even happens in the network security group space. Now, I'm a developer. I'm trying to get my code in for a sprint. I've got a demo. I got to get this thing done, and I'm trying to figure out the security group rules. And I may have taken a networking class at one time in college. I remember a few ports. So I'm kind of punching in a couple of the ports along the way. I deploy my app, it's not working. And so what do? Is I go to the security group and I just change it to a 0.0.0.0/0. And then I deploy my application and it works. It magically works. And
Suddenly.
then I make a little note, come back and fix.
Yeah.
and I don't come back and fix that. And I feel it's the same way with IAM. It's that when we try to be granular and say, I only want this role, the ability to maybe read certain assets within this certain instance, or I only want them to do certain things within S3 bucket. And we start, I'm trying this and I'm trying this. And then there's 200 IAM permissions just for EC2 that finally you just go, if I just do EC2 star on a resource star, everything works. And
it's the wrong way to do it.
Yeah, it magically works, and so does everybody else, and so does the rest of the world. And I think the big theme,
all the hackers works for them too.
Exactly right. Think of it. There have been a number of profile breaches that have been with like Amazon S3. There was a Verizon NICE breach a number of years ago where an employee accidentally opened up the S3 bucket to the world.
Yeah.
And millions of records were exposed in the process, and that can be solved. Absolutely be solved. And it's just, so I think sometimes when we look at the cloud and we look at the opportunities, I hate using the word solve for stupid, but it's the biggest fear that I have is it's the unintentional.
Yeah.
It's someone accidentally doing an error or doing something that causes this door to open and then allows this flood to happen. The intentional stuff, I'll have to deal with those later.
Right. But the accidental,
that's a hard story to tell, right?
Yeah, it is.
Having someone having that on their job, on their mind, and everything with that.
So we talked about managed services. What about cloud services?
Yeah, so cloud services. So this is very interesting. So when we think about the different types of cloud services, actually I have a note here. I want to make sure that I actually pull this up here so I get this one exactly right. Because, oh yes, this is it. If you're not using a certain thing, a cloud service, turn it off.
Yes.
And that's, I think, sometimes as we come in and we start testing things out and we say, oh, I'm just trying out, I'm going to deploy a basic HTML website to an S3 bucket, make it open to the world. I didn't really want to do that anyway. So you kind of forget about it and it's still left there. And it still now is that gateway. And so I feel like the cloud is one of these things that, especially in AWS, there's 100+ services.
Yeah.
And so there's a security side of this, but let's be honest, there's also a cost perspective. You pay per consumption. And so it's one of these models. And I think sometimes people get confused where, the value of the cloud is the ability for it to scale up and down. You pay for what you use. If you're going to throw something out there that is always on and you want it to be redundant, so you spread it over multiple availability zones. And oh, by the way, I want it to have a non-prod version that's also redundant. I know that same instance 4 times over. And then you wonder why it's 4 times more expensive in the cloud than it would have been on-prem. Right. And so, build to the cloud, but if you're not using it, turn it off.
Well, one of the critical things that I always ask for is I want a printout of all your services, and I want a business justification for every service that you're using. Because from my perspective, every service is a potential vulnerability, right? That's why I care about it. But when I ask, tell me the business justification for each of these, they say, well, I don't know. I'm like, well, if you don't know, then you shouldn't be using it. Well, we can't just turn it off. Well, you better figure it out.
That's you're absolutely right. I think you hit it right on the nail on the head on that one, because Amazon built AWS because that's how they run their entire company.
Yes.
So any company can run an entire organization out there, and they've got everything from VPN services to identity services to everything in between. And if you've already got a VPN service that you're using for your company, then disable, and you can use things like service control policies that you can put on the organization that then govern for your entire infrastructure that never allow anybody to deploy that.
Right.
So just turn it off. But to your point, like, why are you using this service out here? You should be able to know what you're using.
Yeah.
from a cost perspective, from a security perspective, because there may be things that you don't want. There's a thing like simple mail service, SNS, or SMS. SNS is
SMS.
simple notification service.
Yeah.
Yeah, SMS. And you think about that from, so from our company's perspective, we have internal SMTP relay servers that we built that when you send email to it, it cannot be sent outside the organization. That's it. We built the rules. Spent a lot of time building this out. And we've also got all the other rules that go with email, right? You got retention policies and email encryption. And you're going to take this SNS service and you're going to give it to a developer and say, do secure things with it. They don't know. They just want to send an email. All right.
Yeah.
So in that way, it's like, if, for our point is you don't need to use this service. Go consume this other service that's already built over here, because of all of the complexities that come with it.
Right.
I think sometimes with DevOps, we think like I have to own the entire ops chain of it. And it's like, well, yeah, I think ops is you consume things, consume centralized services. Not everybody should be spinning up their own B2B services.
Exactly.
That's a lot of management, a lot of headache that come with that.
Yeah. So we only have 2 more points here in our list. The second to last one, you're doing okay so far.
Yeah.
The second to last one is network access.
Yeah, so network access, I think this one really kind of comes down to like, how are you going to connect to the cloud? And there's a number of ways how you as an organization need to kind of approach this. You can build a VPN tunnel. You can completely separate it out. You don't even have to have that connection. If you get really ambitious and you're looking for high-speed connections, you can go to colo facilities like Equinix, and you can go into things like Direct Connect that have a very strong backbone right into the backbone plane of AWS. So you have to be able to look at that. Are you going to allow employees to access development from home on personal devices? So I feel like sometimes networking in the cloud kind of changes a little bit. And I kind of alluded to the notion of security groups, right? A security group in the cloud in AWS it operates on an overlay network, which is just a network on top of another network. And that security group is not protocol aware. You can define a port, but it's not protocol. So if I were a nefarious hacker and I want to tunnel an SSH session right through DNS at port 53, if the security group is going to allow that on an egress out, nothing's going to stop it.
Right.
And so I feel that, in some ways when we look at network access, that the ability to look for like malicious traffic moving laterally, there are things that are coming out that are trying to improve upon that. But in the cloud itself, I can't go buy a physical IPS, IDPS device and just drop it in their data center because they won't allow me access. And 2, when I hook that into the network, how do I know to only inspect these packets and ignore the 900,000 other competitors or other companies' packets, right? It presents itself some different questions. So I think that when organizations look at networking in the cloud, consider a lot of things. Consider how you're going to are you going to allow access into the cloud? You're going to create like a cloud, like an internet gateway. Are you going to allow outbound access through a proxy? Are you going to whitelist? Are you going to do site categorization? Because that's all configurable. And if you don't have a good story to tell about how you set up the cloud, well, then someone's going to say, I need to send this data here, and they're going to set that thing up, and they're going to open that access, and bam, you're out.
Yep, exactly.
So just, in a process, define strategies around how you're going to do things.
A lot of times I ask people to look at it like the cyber kill chain. Like any communication path is a potential for malicious activities, right? And so if you think, at what point is this? Can we kill this activity? At what point can we be aware of it? And that I think speaks a lot to how you configure networking in the cloud. Exactly.
Yeah, it's one of these. I think there's so much customization. I think companies just need to to consider a lot of different options. Sure. Do you treat the cloud as an extension of your data center, or is it a completely different isolated data center?
Right.
Do you want to have connections back in with your internal, company? There's some challenges that come with that.
Right.
Especially if you're going to be replicating things like Active Directory.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you're going to have LDAP connectivity into the cloud, that raises all sorts of additional questions and needs.
Lots of questions. Yeah, absolutely. Especially when you can kind of consider that, for the longest time, we have a traditional DMZ model, right? Where you would have, a separate area and companies build out a separate Active Directory domain for that DMZ. And so just make sure that you're not putting yourself in a situation that you deploy an application that requires a domain to join, and that you don't have that separation, that segregation.
Yeah.
That if that gets popped and then suddenly it's a straight shot right to your internal domain controller, boom, the heartbeat of your company can be compromised, right? It's lights out.
Right.
So
yeah, every architectural decision has to come with a risk assessment from a malicious standpoint. How do we, or even a stupidity standpoint? Because honestly, you've got to take that into consideration.
I solve all of it. When I do risk assessments, it starts at the top. It's external actors, it's internal intentional, it's internal unintentional, right? You cover integrity, confidentiality, and availability. The big thing I've been covering a lot is around possession and utility or other areas. So it's a lot of it is really trying to make sure that you have a good idea of understanding what is your risk, right? I think in the cloud, it's not that there's a lower risk, it's a different type of risk.
Right.
And this idea that, well, hey, everything is possible. Well, yeah, everything is possible. Like everything's awesome. But like really the key in risk is probability. Right. So it's telling that story and then making sure that the right people understand that risk and are willing to accept that risk. And in cases of like managed services, transfer the risk.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. To people who they do the same type of security all the time on that aspect. Okay. So final one is, what is stored?
Yeah, this one is, and as basic as this sounds, I'm surprised in my conversations. Do you know what your data is, and do you know where it's at, and then who has access to it? With a lot of different companies, you ask a single question: should every employee in your company have access to all your data?
No.
And you usually see them kind of go, well, no. Right. And then you ask them, well, what data do you not want people to have access to? Right. Is it Colonel Sanders extra crispy, recipe? Is it the Coca-Cola formula? There's something that sits out there. There's some intellectual property. There's something that you want to protect. And that may be your customers' data. That may be, how you operate. And so the idea is that if you're going to have a cloud environment, know what's out there. Because the first step to secure something is that visibility of knowing what's there. And then you can start going through all the other processes to sit there and go, all right, well, how am I going to secure this? And who should have access? And how long should they have access for? And, all these other things come into play. But the amount of times where it's like, well, my company's using Dropbox. Well, do you know what's stored in Dropbox? I mean, no, I have no idea, but if you go talk to Dropbox, they'll say you got 1,000 accounts with your company's email address, and that data is connected with all these other companies. Do you know about why they're doing businesses with this? No, it's hard stories to tell. And I feel that like as basic as the cloud is, and it's very complex, but also basic. But if you can't answer that question of what is stored, why is it stored, who should have access to it, start there.
Yep. Can't protect it if you don't know where it is.
Exactly. And if you're a company like a pharmaceutical and you're developing $1 billion new drug, like, maybe a vaccine for a particular, SARS-CoV-2 kind of thing, like, do you trust putting it out in the cloud? You better make sure you've got all the controls around that you feel comfortable with that, because that's worth a lot of money.
And that was such a great list to go through. And honestly, we could spend an hour on each one of those topics. I sure appreciate your time today. What's the rest of the year look like for you? Are you speaking anywhere? People want to connect with you? Like, how do people learn more about what you got going on?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm not very active on. Well, I'm on it. A lot of people trying to sell me products. No, so in terms of 2020, so I applied to speak at the IC Squared Security Congress in November. I think that was scheduled for Orlando, and they just announced a couple of weeks ago that they're going to go digital only. I put in for a presentation to talk a little bit more about my company's journey to the cloud. And it's based off a presentation I gave to the Utah chapter IC Squared last year, and it's called An Angsty Journey, and I call it Two Lies and a Truth. And it talks about the idea that in that 5-6 year journey, what I learned as a security professional, what caused me to change and view the cloud differently. I think oftentimes in the world we have to consider, because when we start to consider things differently, we tend to act differently.
Yeah.
Instead of saying, well, it's always done this way, it's always done this way.
Right.
And you can't look at the cloud as a data center. It's a completely different model. I think, early days of security as we kept trying to assess it from, it's just another data center. It's not.
It's not.
And so I put that in. Whether I get approved or not, great. If not, I I hope to present it to a broader audience because there's value in that lesson learned. And in
Sure.
that, I provide some really strong recommendations of things that I experienced.
Yeah.
And a couple of them we've talked about. One of them was like, don't forget serverless.
Yeah.
And I think it's, wow, this thing is not going away. It's going to pick up steam. So, that kind of caught us flat-footed when all of a sudden our developers were writing thousands of Lambda processes. We're like, all right, how do we
What do we do with that?
This?
Yeah.
Yeah. They're asking for a vulnerability report. How do we get that? So.
Well, this has been really terrific, and I found a lot of value in what you had to say. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope to connect with you again in the future.
Let's do part 2. I've got, or 3. I don't know.
Okay.
Maybe depending on the reception, but we've got.
Cook me up some more topics, Craig.
Yeah, and I think just the conclusion that I would give is I think companies, we tend to be a little afraid of things that we don't understand, and security tends to be a little bit more standoffish about the cloud. But again, reemphasize that I firmly believe the cloud has the capability to secure your company's data better than you could, in your normal data centers.
Absolutely agree with you.
Keyword is capability.
All right. Well, thanks, Craig. You take care, and we'll talk to you again.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, Jen.
Thank you for joining us again at the Security Metrics podcast. I hope to see you again next week. Thanks for watching. To watch more episodes of Security Metrics podcast, click on the box on the left. If you prefer to listen to this podcast, it's available on all your favorite podcast platforms. See you on the slopes.